Hello, and welcome to episode 95 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Scottsdale, Arizona, I'm Nick Zaptra. On today's podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Sam Fellows, Senior Lecturer in the Philosophy Department at Lancaster University. In early 2008, at the age of 24, Sam was diagnosed as autistic, specifically Asperger's syndrome. At the time, he was in his second year of a part-time master's in history and philosophy of science at Leeds University. When he got diagnosed, he started taking an interest in autism and psychiatric diagnoses, and he started research in the philosophy of psychiatry. This led to a PhD and a dissertation in the history of autism. Sam's current work focuses on conceptual and methodological issues in psychiatric diagnoses, specifically related to the general question of what are psychiatric diagnoses and are they any good, the importance of involving what he terms experts by experience when revising psychiatric diagnostic criteria, the challenge of establishing the accuracy of self-diagnosis in psychiatry, neurodiversity, and specific issues related to autism and other diagnoses. Sam hosts his own podcast, The Philosophy of Psychiatric Diagnoses, the links of which you can find on YouTube and on his website, samfellows.com. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Sam. Dr. Sam Fellows, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this Thursday evening?
I'm okay. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm really happy to have you, a fellow philosopher of psychiatry on the podcast. I am always particularly pleased. So how are things going with you this summer? What have you found yourself up to?
Oh, well, I've just been finishing off my book mainly. That's the key thing. It's just it got back the final revisions, and there's just a few things that needs fixing, maybe a couple of thousand words. So hopefully that's 99%, well, probably more than 99% done, and hopefully coming out in October, I believe, is the date I've heard. We'll see.
Congratulations. And
so that's the main current thing.
Sure. And now, is this the book In Defense of Psychiatric Diagnoses?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, great. So I imagine, writing a book is a challenge in itself. Can you tell us a little bit about what that process has been like so far?
Yeah, it's, I don't think I took the exact best approach to writing it, insofar as when I started a postdoc, I basically wrote the whole thing, at least a first major draft, in about 6 months, and then I started working on papers, and honestly, the other way around would have been, I think, much better, because having got that first complete draft, I then had to go back and really rethink significant portions. So that I don't think really helped. I think it's taken longer than it should have done, but ultimately I hope it's roughly worked. I suppose I quite enjoy having a whole book to write as opposed to individual papers. Having a much larger word count is certainly preferable to having, 10,000 words or whatever.
Right. And so I suppose we might end up talking a little bit more about it toward the later part of this interview. But can you tell us a little bit about kind of what are some of the main ideas and the main focus of the book?
So I suppose I'm trying to say that psychiatric diagnoses are better than people think, at least some critics think. I suppose I'm doing that by basically saying, on one hand, the criticisms made against them aren't as strong as people think. And secondly, by also trying to say science in general isn't as strong as people think. So I'm trying to, in a sense, reduce the strength of the criticisms and, in a sense, reduce the strength of the science. And hopefully, in between that, psychiatry starts looking a bit more respectable than compared to some sort of idealized image of science. So if you've got a sort of idea of science whereby it's about trying to find out what's going on in the external world by getting a one-to-one description of it, that's sort of what a lot of critics seem to have in mind. And they're saying, well, psychiatry doesn't do that, therefore it's not any good. And my point is, well, maybe if we have a more moderate view of science, then that's not a particularly good target, and psychiatry could be doing better. I'm not saying it's great. I do suggest in the book all sorts of ways we can improve psychiatry and change it, but by trying to have a more realistic and nuanced view of science. But I suppose that's what I'm trying to do.
I love that approach. What do you maybe have like one or two examples where you might see diagnoses as slightly better than perhaps the critics or the perception would give them in sort of our current understanding?
I suppose, for example, I portray psychiatric diagnoses as being idealized and abstract models, which I take as being in some way in line with the rest of science. Now, when you're doing modeling in science, you have to make a choice as to what methodological techniques you employ and what you're going to abstract and not. So what you consider to be noise and what you're considering to be relevant. So there's lots of critics who say, well, the DSM is just simply a case of a bunch of people sitting around a table voting on one psychiatric diagnosis versus another. And that's not what science consists of. In other words, you shouldn't be able to choose what psychiatric diagnoses they are. If that happens, it's not proper science. And I'm saying, well, actually, there's loads of choices involved in science when we go about modeling the world. That's one general argument I've sort of used. And I suppose the second one is that lots of critics basically say, well, psychiatric diagnoses miss out lots of important details of people. So they might list what symptoms somebody has, but they don't tell you about, say, for example, their past life history, their current life situation, their future life goals. That's perfectly true. But if we take psychiatric diagnoses as being models that take an idealized and abstract view of the world that considers some things as noise, that's not in itself problematic because we're idealizing and abstracting them away for some purposes. For other purposes, we want to include them in the model. But in other purposes, we don't. So those are sort of two ways in which I try to respond to critics.
Fantastic. I'm very sympathetic to both of those arguments, as we're just coming from philosophy of science and understanding the way science actually works very much in practice, especially in relation to expert-led decisions. It's not just that psychiatry is necessarily doing something all that different than that happens in other kinds of sciences. So it's really good of you to make those connections. I really look forward to the book coming out. So thank you for sharing a little bit about that so far. Now you're in you're in Lancaster, is that right?
It's Lancaster, United Kingdom.
Lancaster.
Yes.
Fantastic. How's the weather out there?
Currently grey outside. It's sort of varying between really hot and lots of rain sort of thing. But it's all right. It's all right. It does rain a lot here, but it's a nice place to live. Lots of greenery all around, lots of places to go cycling and stuff. So it's all good.
Very nice. Very nice. What's the university life like?
I like the university. It's kind of outside of Lancaster itself, so it's about 20-minute cycle ride outside through, well, perhaps not the countryside, but say the suburbs, and then into some of the countryside. And it's nicely spread out, and there's lots of fields nearby, so it kind of feels separate from everything else. So I kind of like that sort of feel to it. And it's got a good atmosphere, I suppose.
Nice. Well, I'd love to hear a little bit more, but before that, let's hear a little bit about you, Sam, in terms of how you came to find your way into philosophy of science in general, and a little bit more about your background. So tell us, Sam, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Aberdeen in Scotland, so basically pretty far up on the east coast of Scotland. Oh, wait. Yes, east coast of Scotland. I always get them confused. Yeah, it's pretty cold up there for Granite City. Apparently, something like 40% of the population have what's known as seasonal affective disorder. In other words, they get really depressed in winter time. So mental health's probably not the best place up there. But yeah, it was an interesting place to grow up. There's certainly a lot worse places I could have grown up.
Sure. Yeah, so it's cold. So yeah, I'm looking at it on the maps now. So sort of in the northern eastern part of the country. So, okay. What were you interested in growing up? What kinds of things, caught your attention?
Well, my interests were in, I guess, computer games, models, as it were, role-playing and wargaming sort of stuff, racing cars, all very technical, I suppose. Not so much into the the arts or general socializing. I suppose that's kind of what I was like for quite a lot of time when I was growing up.
What were the computer games? I was curious. I did some gaming myself back in the day.
I was obsessed with Command and Conquer, I suppose.
Yeah.
Alpha Centauri for PC. That's a spectacular game. I don't know. I had an N64, so Zelda 64, that sort of thing.
Right. Yep.
GoldenEye, Jet Force Gemini, Banjo-Kazooie. There was all sorts of.
Yep.
Yeah, there was some. Thinking about it, F-Zero X is probably my favorite all-time game.
F-Zero X.
So I don't know if there was F-Zero on the Super Nintendo and F-Zero GX on the GameCube, but it's it's kind of very minimalist. It's a racing game, but you're up against 30 different cars, and each track, it's 3 laps on each track, and they last about 30 seconds. So you have to go from last to first in about 30 seconds. It's a very good game, designed by Shigeru Miyamoto, if I remember correctly. So, the main man behind Nintendo. I would strongly recommend it on an emulator, or I suppose you can buy it.
All right. Well, I loved N64. I'm surprised. I feel like, well, now I have to try it on an emulator.
I would recommend it.
No, there were some magical times in the games, and I ended up. I was playing the 64, and then some of those Command and Conquer games, and then found my way to Counter-Strike for a while, and just kind of stayed with that. But then, unfortunately, didn't stick with it as much as I could. All right. Well, okay. So into games and things like that growing up. What else was life like? Growing up. What were things going on in Scotland? What were you up to? What were some of what was happening?
So I suppose I can't really say I enjoyed school. I was very much into the sciences. Mm-hmm. I wanted to do as much science as possible, but I can't say I enjoyed much else that was happening. I didn't really get on well with people, so it wasn't a particularly happy childhood, to be honest. Lots of problems at home. So my eldest brother was schizophrenic. Although I only found this out much later, my other brother was ADHD, and of course I'm autistic. So it was quite a combination, shall we say. And I'm pretty sure my father, you could have made an argument that he was autistic. I'm not totally sure if he was or not, but he certainly had a lot of traits. So it was a very unusual family life, I suppose. I wasn't particularly very happy at school or home, I suppose, which kind of led to a lot of, obviously a lot of loneliness, but also a lot of depression, especially as I became sort of into my later teenage years. So, I suppose I did a lot of withdrawing from friends, withdrawing from people. I suppose I got really into literature instead. Was sort of my main interest at one point, which, that's kind of what my youth was. And then eventually I decided I had to get out. So I left for university. Well, I left school a year early, because I couldn't handle it psychologically. I did start a degree in computing, which I then couldn't handle psychologically. So I quit. I was also in Aberdeen, and I went to Wales for my undergraduate because it was basically, I looked on a map and it was as far away from Aberdeen as you could literally get, more or less.
Gotcha.
Without leaving the country.
Right. Okay. All right. So already, right away, some experience and exposure to psychiatry in a very lived experience sense. And, seems like a lot of us, at least in connection to philosophy of psychiatry, we either have lived experience where we've, connected in that way, have struggled in our youth, or have family where we have direct experience. It often can motivate our sort of research or just general interest in life. So you mentioned though you went into computer. So you had attempted to go into computer science, but then decided just kind of against it, or it just wasn't for you.
I think I wanted to be a computer games programmer, if I remember correctly, but I got very disillusioned. I suppose quite a lot of people I knew from school who I wanted to escape were also doing the exact same course. So it just didn't work out. I kind of realized that if I wanted to go to university, it needed to be a clean break, I think. I wanted to go to a new place, new environment. I didn't mind computer programming, but I didn't want to do it for a living. Now I think about it, it just wouldn't have been very enjoyable. So no, I had to get out of there.
Okay, well, tell us a little bit about, how philosophy. I mean, was philosophy on the radar at all? Was that something that you were interested in?
So when I was considering a new undergraduate, I had basically two choices. It was either English or philosophy. I was torn between the two of them. And then I saw this degree in Wales, which, as mentioned, was an advantage, called Science and Science Fiction. So it was approximately 1/3 science fiction, and I was really into 1960s to 70s new wave science fiction. So the literature criticism appealed to me a lot, and the rest there was a lot of history of science, sociology of science, science communication, and then a bit of philosophy of science as well. So that's basically what appealed to me. It was a chance to do two different areas I was interested in. And when I started it, admittedly, perhaps the philosophy of science wasn't as strong as I'd have liked, but in my spare time, I very heavily started reading in philosophy of science. So I read the Kuhn, Popper, Fairbairn sort of thing, and then, I don't know, Van Frassen, and who else was I reading at that time? Lakatos, of course, people like that. I sort of got into it via that means. And I realized that I wanted to do this. I really wanted to do philosophy. For literature criticism, as much as I enjoyed it, wasn't what I wanted to do. And also I was interested in the history of science. So at some point, when I was finishing that, I thought a master's in history and philosophy of science is what I wanted to do, basically. And so I went to Leeds University to do that.
Yeah. What are things like at Leeds? I feel like I've seen some folks from philosophy of science there. What kind of representation do they have there?
Oh, well, this would have been 2006 to 2008. So quite some time ago, but it was really big on structural realism at the time. So Stephen French and structural realism and stuff like that.
That's what it is. That's right.
Yeah, that seemed to be the main vibe going on at the time. Also, plenty of history of medicine as well, and it was good. We had lots of visiting speakers. So one of the essays was, write an essay on various visiting write multiple essays on different visiting speakers. It was fun. So it really opened my mind to lots of different challenges going on, lots of different diversity.
Wonderful, wonderful. And so you had decided philosophy of science was what you'd wanted to do. So how did you decide in terms of getting to turn it into a profession? What were some of the next steps? So this was the big time, I suppose, a big change. So it was a part-time master's, and I'd done the first year and I'd really enjoyed it. And I was looking forward to the second year. It's fair to say my mental health started to plummet pretty badly. And eventually I started seeing various psychologists and psychiatrists, and someone suggested to me, have you heard of this thing called autism? And I was like, oh, what's that? And then they described it to me, and I was like, yeah, that kind of fits. And so it was halfway through the master's, actually. I mean, I had a slight interest in psychiatry prior to this, but nothing sustained. And then it was like, well, here we go. This seems to be a pretty good account of who I am and explains a lot. So that got me very interested in that area. Now, I didn't really have time to actually, the second year of my master's was kind of basically trying to rescue it because my mental health was really so incredibly low that I didn't really want to start looking at a whole new area of philosophy of psychiatry. So I kind of got through the second year. And, I spent a couple of years being unemployed, unfortunately, but I did spend that time to sort of think about what I actually want to do. And PhD in philosophy of psychiatry was pretty much it. That was the next step. And that's how I ended up at Lancaster. So I wanted to do a PhD with Rachel Cooper at Lancaster University. Yeah, for those who don't know, Rachel Cooper is a very well-known philosopher of psychiatry in the community.
Yes, I think I'm pretty lucky to have her as a supervisor.
Oh, wonderful.
So basically, I suppose I had a lot of different motives as to what I was thinking. I was quite heavily into sort of like an anti-realist position initially when I was doing philosophy of science. I was certainly I was quite fascinated by the idea that in some sort of sense, modern science might potentially be wrong, and it could go through another sort of major paradigm shift sort of thing. That's kind of what got me really excited about philosophy of science. And I suppose the idea of, well, maybe more moderately, that we're producing idealized models that don't correspond to the world, and there could be alternative physics, that sort of thing. Those sorts of general ideas I had in my head. So I was kind of like a bit of a, maybe not a skeptic, but certainly, no, I wasn't a skeptic. I was more like taking an anti-realist approach. And then I get this diagnosis, and it's like, well, it just fits. It fits. So I was like, well, how do I, given my sort of general anti-realist position, how do I accommodate that within, hey, I think I'm autistic? What sort of stance should I take to this? Yeah. That's one thing. And also, I met a lot of autistic people at the time, and I suppose I was struck by two different things. On one hand, it seemed an incredibly powerful tool to understand them. At the same time, there was a lot of differences between them.
Right.
So how can it simultaneously be a tool for understanding people and at the same time be really heterogeneous? So it's people can be autistic and yet very different. That in a sense is a bit of a contradiction almost, well, potentially. So that's what I wanted to sort of look at in my PhD, of what exactly is the status of autism? How can we if we were to take sort of a scientific realist view, where would autism fit, and what consequences would follow from that? That's kind of what my PhD was on.
Fantastic.
I can talk more about.
I would love to. Yeah. Sorry. So this is really interesting. So, I mean, what we've gone over is that, so you received, did you self-diagnose or receive an autism diagnosis later in adult life? Is that right?
So it was, I was 24, I think it was 24 when I was diagnosed, officially diagnosed at 24.
Okay.
But it was only suggested about 6 months prior, or 8 months prior.
So yeah. And now, I mean, I'm not, and I imagine that's actually probably more common than one thinks, is that there can be diagnoses early on now, as there's like, in early childhood and early life, but it's also very common that, I know that you hear this frequently with certain certain diagnoses that have been related to the other conceptualization of neurodiversity, like things like ADHD and, other kinds. But, so I imagine that, so that's really fascinating. And then also taking that to then go on to examine further what it means in terms of into your work. Yeah, tell us a little bit about, I guess, what are sort of your main takeaways, or what was it like ending up doing a dissertation as well on something that you have a personal connection to?
So firstly, it was both history of autism and philosophy. So very much the history I was doing was with a philosophical purpose. So I basically tried to look at anti-realist sort of arguments. So pessimistic meta-induction, induction, underdetermination, and then theory-laden nature of evidence, and look at the history to say, well, what's gone on in the history? Can we sort of make these arguments work? Do these arguments work given the history? And the short answer is they partially do, but I don't think massively strongly. So if we take something like autism and look at the notions that we've had of autism since, say, 1940s, I mean, there's been lots of changes in relation to severity. So the idea of how severe it is, or how severe it can be, or typically is. Lots of changes in relation to stuff like the amount of people who are autistic. But when it comes to what symptoms are associated with it, there have been changes, but they've not been huge. So, for example, I compared descriptions under the cognitive psychoanalytical era to the cognitive psychological era. Very different theoretical framework of explaining causes, but when it came to looking at symptoms, they're kind of similar. They're not identical. There's definitely a different emphasis, but at the same time, it still looks like we're dealing with what you might call the same thing in inverted commas. So that's a sort of tool I use to say, well, have there been massive shifts that look like some sort of pessimistic meta-induction? Can we get can we actually find underdetermination arguments? Now, admittedly, I'm not saying if we look at sort of a rigor used in, say, physics, you're going to get some sort of like structural continuity you might find in mathematics. No.
Sure.
So it's not going to necessarily impress a skeptic, but at the same time, it's not a classic case otherwise of, yes, there have been wide-scale changes whereby what we considered autism today is unrecognizable to something in the past. So that was like half of it. Now, the other half, I suppose, well, I was both interested in scientific realism, but I was also interested in models. And I suppose I don't really know when I started this how those two things would exactly line up together. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, I suppose as things progressed, I basically said, well, if we're going to think of realism, we need to move beyond natural kinds. That's, I suppose, the key idea. So the key way people have tried to defend psychiatric diagnoses is say, at least philosophers of psychiatry, is say, if they were natural kinds, then they would be scientifically legitimate.
Right.
That's sort of the general methodology. However,
so we have to find
that
those
fails
kinds. Right.
Because they're so heterogeneous, both from the symptoms covered and the causes covered. They're so heterogeneous. So in that regard, if we're going to be a realist based upon natural kinds, it looks like current psychiatric diagnoses are not the real ones, and indeed it's not so clear what a natural kind would look like in psychiatry given the heterogeneity, unless you're going to massively expand notions of natural kinds.
Right.
So I suppose I was kind of influenced by structural realism here. Again, I'm using the terms very loosely, but the basic idea is, rather than looking for sort of entities that have homogeneous properties, it's more a case of, can we find real statistical correlations? And if we take a different sort of metaphysics, whereby the whole aim of science, or at least some parts of science, is not looking for these homogeneous natural kinds, but instead trying to say, can we find a whole bunch of statistical correlations that we can group together into a psychiatric diagnosis through using mathematical techniques, various methodologies, or indeed more broadly, theoretical virtues, then in that sort of sense, can we sort of make an argument towards realism or not? So I suppose it's basically saying, if we're going to say psychiatric diagnoses are real or not, don't use natural kinds, use theoretical virtues. Now, obviously, you could try and say those two things are the same or not. I tried to disassociate the two of them. Does that mean psychiatric diagnoses are or not real? Well, I suppose they're more realist than the critics make out, but at the same time, they're not the one final set. Now, admittedly, throughout this time period, when I was working on this, I encountered a couple of new philosophies, namely scientific perspectivism and neo-Kantianism, and I was like, yes, they're right. So the mistake I was making previously was I was trying to challenge the realist position, but I perhaps didn't have a sufficient idea of if we're going to move away from traditional realism, what's the alternative? I didn't have a fully developed idea. I wanted to get rid of natural kinds and these sort of conventional stuff out there that we either find or we don't, and have we have a correspondence to or not. I wanted to reject correspondence. What was the alternative? So I came across scientific perspectivism and neo-Kantianism. And I suppose, yes, those two positions have lots of broader differences, but they're roughly similar in some regards, insofar as they're both rejecting a God's eye view of the world. So whatever's going on out there, we can't see the world as it is. We can only see it as it appears to us, or as it appears given a particular theory or methodology, that sort of idea. And so in that regard, I can respond to the critics by saying, well, yes, autism is not this thing out there waiting to be found natural kind, but it could be scientifically respectable if we take it as something that, in a sense, we have, well, I always talk about idealized and abstract models. You could say it's something we've, in a sense, constructed, but provided we've constructed it according to a decent methodology or a decent theory, or using decent, say, principles, theoretical virtues, then that at least counts as good science, potentially, at least acceptable science. I'm more interested in the notion of legitimate science rather than necessarily the correct. It's, as long as the ways we look at the world are compatible with standard scientific techniques, theoretical virtues, modeling principles, that sort of thing, then it's potentially legitimate science. That's my kind of response to the critics. Admittedly, I think that then commits me to some sort of pluralist position, If autism is a good psychiatric diagnosis, so could subtypes, so could alternative ways, say merging autism and schizophrenia, so could alternative models that get rid of autism. They're different ways of modeling the world. Yeah. And I'm not saying that autism is the correct one. It's just, it's an all right one. And I think we should use that, and I think we should use alternatives. I suppose that's my main philosophical response to
somewhere in the middle. No, I love it. It's like, it's a little bit better, but it's not all better. And you're not here completely defending like this is, you know, you're taking a very nuanced and fine approach that says the either of the polar positions is not necessarily correct, and we need to find some other way of particularly explaining it. My initial reaction is also, so I love obviously the focus of exploring this kind of your particular philosophy of science in relation to one particular disorder, and perhaps as it relates to other disorders. I'm curious, like, is there something special about the way in which you looked at autism in particular so deeply, and like, is there something in relation to autism applying your same line of reasoning could your line of reasoning, I guess, be applied to all diagnoses or only a subset of diagnoses? Like, does it work? Like, have you thought about that, where it's like it works well for things like you know, I know in early philosophy of psychiatry, there is a sense where like there is a mapping in terms of those which we feel are more strongly neurologically connected or something like that we have more stance. And like at what point would your line of reasoning potentially differentiate to some other diagnosis? Or is this like, here's a case with autism, this is how it works, we can extrapolate this to pretty much any diagnosis?
So where I think autism has got a particular strength that's not going to be applicable to all the diagnoses is that it covers so many symptoms. And to get a diagnosis, if we're following the DSM, this might not be true in relation to actually how it's employed within psychiatric practice. But if we're following the DSM, it's actually got quite a stringent criteria. So on one hand, it covers a lot of diagnoses. So in that regard, it adds to simplicity. So if we want to have a system of psychiatry that incorporates all relevant phenomena, so that's like a theoretical virtue of coverage or completeness, autism covers a lot of stuff, covers a lot of symptoms. But we also want to have, and that potentially helps simplicity because it's one diagnosis that covers a lot of stuff. But we also want to have a level of cohesion, whereby rather than just having, one diagnosis that covers everything and anyone can get, it's cohesive because when I was looking at it originally, 3 different lists on the 3 different diagnostic criteria. So most diagnoses have 1 diagnostic criteria. On autism, one list on the diagnostic criteria. You need to exhibit so many symptoms from that 1 list. Autism had 3, although in the DSM-5 it moved down to 2 different lists. So you can have all the symptoms on 1 list and none on the other. You don't get an autism diagnosis. You can have all the symptoms on 1 list and I forget what it is, 40% on the other. You shouldn't get the diagnosis according to the DSM. So it both has a lot of coverage and it's quite cohesive when properly applied. So it helps coverage, it helps simplicity, but still retaining cohesiveness. Now, granted, if you then apply that to causes, admittedly, I don't know as much about the causes of other diagnoses. Yes, autism is very heterogeneous causally. Is it more heterogeneous causally than other diagnoses? That I suppose I couldn't tell you from the top of my head. There is a level of cohesion there, but I don't know. I don't know enough about other diagnoses to know how cohesive it is. So, in comparison, for example, if you were to take something like social anxiety disorder, that covers very, very few symptoms. And so you might want to say, that's not contributing much to a system of psychiatry because it's not incorporating many symptoms within it. So you might want to say, rather than have that as a diagnosis, you might want to have that as, say, a personality trait or something. So it might still be something that falls under the domain of medicine, but it's not a diagnosis in the same sense as autism. Or on the other hand, because it doesn't cover many symptoms, Or on the other hand, you've got something like major depressive disorder, whereby, yes, that covers 9 symptoms, so not as many as autism. It still covers a fair number, much more than social anxiety disorder, but it's not so cohesive because you need 5 of 9 symptoms, but you can have any 5 as long as one's low mood. Whereas if you just simply have, so what would that be? Just above 50% of symptoms of autism, that's not going to guarantee you a diagnosis unless they're certain ones from each particular diagnostic list. So something like major depressive disorder, I think that should be a diagnosis, but it's potentially too broad. So that's why I thought autism had at least exhibited some theoretical virtues more than other diagnoses. Obviously, there's hundreds of diagnoses out there, but that was my general thought of it probably does better than most diagnoses on these sorts of theoretical virtues. Admittedly, I think my argument worked better under DSM-4 notions of autism, where there's 3 lists rather than 2, and it potentially stops working quite a lot if we move from the DSM definition to the more expansive definition we have in the general society culture. Often people think about autism because because it's not so cohesive now as it was 15 years ago, let's say.
Sure. No, I really appreciate the specificity that you and the qualifying that you're making, even in compared to like the different manual iterations, because as we know, like things do change from DSM-4 to DSM-5. And I think it's also, most people don't know this, but like the different expert groups in terms of revising the criteria and how they're made differ from disorder to disorder, at least, or disorder groupings. I believe there's 21 disorder groupings. And so autism, those who are making the decisions in terms of the kind of criteria could be very different for another kind of disorder. I mean, it's a different set of people. Only there's an oversight committee that will review them. But this is really interesting. So in some ways, you perhaps are advocating or suggesting maybe not outright, but it sounds like there's some positives in terms of the way autism is framed, or the sort of the cohesiveness or whatever kind of theoretical virtue you're mentioning is demonstrative in certain criteria lists in an autism as opposed to some other disorders. And in some ways, like those other disorders could benefit from being more like autism and so, or like represent, or perhaps, and it's interesting because I'm sure they're aware of that, but they might not want to for some other conventional reasons, like not scientific reasons per se, like more like inclusivity or something like that.
That is admittedly one potential issue that I have with my general philosophy, is that I'm mainly interested in analytical philosophy of science, whereas psychiatric diagnoses serve many different purposes. So there could be plausibly a good reason to have a psychiatric diagnosis that was significantly worse science than it could be, because loads of people already have it and they formed a community and get on well with other people with the same diagnosis, that sort of thing. There could be all sorts of practical reasons to not have the best science.
Right.
But when it comes, I've been trying to work out what the best science would be rather than trying to focus specifically on the practical things. I do have some interesting views on that, but they're nowhere near as worked out.
Sure. Well, so if you were to say, okay, for those who want to know more, or from your experience of having studied autism and from a historical perspective, and perhaps maybe some of your new work, what are some, a couple take home points for those who might not know about it, or for things to expect, or from your point of view in terms of either the itself as a diagnosis or how best to think about it?
Autism, not my work on it.
Well, I'm curious, like you as an expert in terms of the history of autism, but in thinking about autism, like, yeah. So I'm just, something like I'm considering you an expert in terms of the history, as well as just in terms of perhaps current thinking in terms of diagnoses. And if you have any points that you would like that you feel like would be good take homes or ways to frame or think about it that perhaps either people might get a little bit incorrect, or that would be good things to think about.
So I suppose just on a general level, you've got 2 different ways of thinking about psychiatric diagnoses, and this happens in relation to autism a lot. That being, everyone's different, so we don't need psychiatric diagnoses, versus someone just is their diagnosis. And I suppose when it comes to most diagnoses, I'll try to say, well, neither of those stances are useful. Psychiatric diagnoses can in general be helpful for understanding people, even though people are much more than their diagnosis. Now, in relation to autism specifically, I think one interesting aspect of that is things like the neurodiversity movement and sort of user activism, because there's a lot of attempts to basically reclaim the narrative about autism and what it is and what it isn't. And so, for example, one thing that's commonly stated is that it's offensive. Well, not commonly. It's a myth that autism involves a lack of empathy or an empathy deficit. That's something you quite commonly often see. So I suppose one take home I would say is there's lots of heterogeneity of autism, and personally I disagree with quite a lot of narratives about it. I can't talk about anyone else, but I have an empathy deficit as far as I can see. If we understand autism on terms of, if we understand empathy in terms of feeling what someone else feels, that sort of notion of empathy, that's something I really struggle with. So a lot of the narratives you see about autism, for example, there's no empathy deficit, well, it doesn't apply to me, and certainly I've met a fair number of autistic people who've never suggested anything different. So that's one thing I would emphasize. I don't want to say these people are necessarily, a lot of these modern narratives are wrong. It's just some autistic people think that they're potentially wrong, or at least are slightly puzzled by them and are trying to understand what's going on. That's one take home I'd say. I'm not too sure what you have in mind when it comes to.
No, this one's perfect. What you just said was great. I mean, I think in connection to, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say another thing, I suppose, is one other thing to understand about autism is that you've got that challenge, that contrast I mentioned earlier between it's a good way of understanding people versus people with autism are very different. I think, again, that's also potentially an issue with a lot of the modern narratives about autism, insofar as, I see how dangerous I'm going to start insulting people now.
That's okay.
There's a lot of differences insofar as who's getting diagnosed with autism today, as far as I can tell, than used to be diagnosed. And so you've got a question of how representative people actually are today compared to people who got diagnosed in the distant past, potentially in the quite recent distant past. Indeed, it's worth noting a lot of activists say we need to expand our notion of autism. And so they explicitly want an expansive notion of autism, whereas a lot of people, some people anyway, don't think autism should be expanded. I can see arguments either way. The key issue is that I don't think that a lot of a lot of the activists are basically saying the current narratives about autism are unrepresentative, and so they've tried to change that. There's a danger they might change it in a way that then means the previous narratives, whatever level of accuracy they had, are now being sort of eclipsed. Potentially, there's a middle ground somewhere, and I don't know where it is, of exactly how broad autism should be and exactly who should represent it. Those are very complicated issues. I don't know, but suffice to say, a lot of people have strong views on this, and I would just say there's probably going to be alternative views. Whether they're better views or worse views, I don't know, but there's going to be alternative views. So I'd bear that in mind as well.
Yeah, and it was interesting when I teaching a course in mind and medicine, I was exposed to some papers on the neurodiversity movement, and to see some differences of opinion, in particular relation to some who were rejecting diagnoses outright or past diagnoses outright, or also those who saw some sort of a middle ground or a cohesiveness where they identified as neurodiverse, but also identified with the diagnosis. And so that was it. I don't know, as someone who's not representative, at least initially, I cannot speak from lived experience, but I also am sympathetic to, I don't know, I'm sympathetic to people holding different positions, even the ones that are more polar, but also I tend to be more of like someone who's looking for that nuance and looking for somewhere. So someone like you who's sharing their sort of positions of trying to be sympathetic, but also trying to generally, find something that might be closer to, well, I don't want to say closer to the truth because it could be wrong. It could be one of these more polar sides could be ultimately the favorable position. But I'm simply, yeah, I get where you're going for. So okay, thank you. No, I appreciate you sharing that. It's complicated, and the narratives are changing. It will be interesting to see what's happening. Well, tell us. Okay, thank you for going and expounding on about that. You mentioned a little bit before we chatted that you've been getting up to some new work in philosophy of psychiatry. I thought now would be a good time to share a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, about, I don't know, 2 years ago, I suppose, I decided I wanted to move away from the philosophical status of psychiatric diagnoses onto other areas, but admittedly, I then had to get back to finishing the book. So that's actually been the last 6 months have been a major part of that. So I've not had time to fully focus on this, but I've had a few publications in these new areas. So Two different areas. Firstly, experts by experience and psychiatric research. So put simply, autistic people studying autism. Yeah. There's lots and lots of enthusiasm about this. Now, I want to sort of philosophically analyze it, I suppose coming from 3 different angles. Firstly, as I discussed earlier, I think that science isn't really about finding the one-to-one description of reality. It's about building fallible and idealistic models that give us limited views of reality. So if these activists are basically saying the old theories are largely wrong, here's a bunch of new ones, my initial response is, well, are those new theories, are they better? And if they are better, well, they're probably not going to be the one complete answer. So it's more, my perspective would be more likely 2 different views, potentially as good as each other, or one view that's slightly better than the other. Mm-hmm. And especially if you consider epistemological questions, sort of, I suppose there's good reason to believe that a lot of scientific research isn't that great. It's just when you do enough of it, you eventually get some rough overall image of what is potentially going on. So I think there's a lot of challenges towards saying any particular piece of scientific research is likely correct. And I think that's also true of expert by experience research. So that's the first general point of they're often very enthusiastic, and I'm not that enthusiastic about physics, for example. They seem to have a very enthusiastic view that goes beyond even what I think the best science can do. Second issue is, again, coming back to the modeling thing, if you accept that large portions of science, or indeed all of it, who knows, involves idealistic models, then I think we should understand the process of expert by experience research as a case of producing idealized models specifically of lived experience. So it's not a case of, I'm autistic, I therefore have lived experience of autism, and I'm going to access my lived experience to tell you what autism is like. It's a case of, I'm autistic, I have lived experience, I'm going to produce an idealized and abstract model of that lived experience. So if we want to think of in terms of correspondence, my description of what it's like to be autistic does not have a one-to-one correspondence with my experience, the sort of lived experience. Yeah. And the third issue, which admittedly I don't know as much about, but I'm trying to get into, is feminology. Mm-hmm. Feminology, as I understand it, is stunningly difficult. It's a really hard area of philosophy, and lots of feminologists who have been incredibly intelligent, incredibly knowledgeable, have got it wrong in the past. Yeah. When you're doing expert by experience research, you're effectively doing feminology, as far as I can tell, or at least when it comes to the lived experience aspect. When it comes to drawing upon the lived experience aspect, you're effectively doing feminology. And feminology is really difficult. So I think lived experience research should be done. And I don't think it's going to be necessarily worse than typical science, but I don't think it's going to be necessarily better, or at least much better. I can see an argument as it being better, but I don't think it's going to be a case of lived experience research is largely right, non-lived experience research is largely incorrect. And that certainly seems to be, at least in relation to, say, theories about autism that have been produced by non-autistic people, they're often heavily rejected by experts by experience. Meanwhile, theories that have been produced by autistic people, there's a lot of enthusiasm for them. Whereas my stance is going to be, I'm not willing to really say we're getting it right. So those are the three issues I want to try and understand expert by experience research in terms of scientific models, and in doing so, basically try and say, yeah, things are more complicated than potentially I've seen in the literature, and we're probably going to struggle to get things as right as we think. Yeah. That's one of the two things. Do you want to come back on that? Or
no, I just want to say I love I'm very excited to read these papers, because it's something I hadn't thought in words in terms of what it means to have to, as you put it, expert, to provide an expert by experience account, and how we should frame that in sort of an evidentiary way. And I think your criticism, or at least, modest approach to understanding it is really helpful. And just having the words to think about it as an idealized model, I think, is really interesting. I'd love to think more about that. I don't have any pushback immediately. I just think it makes a lot of sense. In particular, I mean, it'd be interesting to, I suppose, look at some of the potential limitations to expert. I mean, obviously there's limitations to expert by experience in general, but in particular with disorders where like cognitive insight is lacking. I feel like there are disorders such that, a hallmark of certain disorders is like a lack of awareness in regard to the experience. Like there is the experience of the disorder, but then there's certain things where the individual may not be fully aware of that they either have the disorder or will have temporal experiences of not being aware. And so I just think that's just really interesting in terms of just thinking more about what expert by experience can give us, what are its limitations. And so, yeah, that's it. What was the next thing you wanted to talk about?
So the other one is self-diagnosis, basically philosophically analyzing self-diagnosis, mainly epistemologically analyzing it. So self-diagnosis has kicked off in a big way. There's, again, lots and lots of really enthusiastic people about people who support it, and lots of people who think it's terrible.
Yeah.
I guess my stance is, at least when I started in 2022, the amount of scientific research on it is very, very low. I've recently tried to read everything I can find on it. I found 30 studies, the majority of which, I believe literally over half have been published in 2023 or 2024. So When I started out, there was very little, and even today there's not that much. And most of these studies involve, maybe 10 different studies might try and establish, is self-diagnosis accurate or not? So there's really not much data on it. And secondly, there's even less conceptual work on it. And to put it simply, the only two papers I know of currently that have been written by a philosopher on self-diagnosis are both mine. So I've been trying to I think
I saw the posted either on Twitter or through it coming up in my Scholar feed. So yeah. Well,
yeah, I could be wrong, and if I am wrong, please everyone send me these papers I'm not aware of. But certainly last time I checked, which was, I did try to find everything I could find about 3 months ago, and then I've been slowly reading through it. I couldn't find anything else that I call a work of philosophy, or at least anything beyond a dedicated paper on it beyond a few paragraphs. Now, Why is it interesting? Mm-hmm. Firstly, again, it comes back to lived experience. That's the key argument that, it works in two different ways, which firstly, the idea is that if you go into a diagnostic assessment, you have lived experience of your condition, whereas the person who's diagnosing you doesn't have lived experience. Therefore, you are in a better position to judge that you have the condition than the diagnostician. Now, granted, that's a circular argument because we're assuming you have the condition for that to work. But I suppose more sympathetically, if you're autistic, then you are in a better position to establish you're autistic compared to a diagnostician. that's one argument. Is that true or not? Well, I suppose I've outlined my concerns about lived experience.
Right.
Yes, it's a way of producing knowledge. So there's lots of different ways of producing knowledge. A lot of them are going to have strengths and weaknesses. I don't know exactly how good that lived experience is compared to what the diagnostician does. It's also worth noting there are literally tens of thousands, more maybe, psychiatrists and mental health workers. So they're going to take different approaches. And also, when somebody self-diagnoses, they can do it in so many different ways. I mean, does somebody might go and read 20 scientific papers on it. Someone else, I mean, theoretically, might just see an autistic person on TV.
Yeah.
We actually have very little data on how to the degree to which people actually investigate these. I'm assuming it's going to be very rare that people do virtually no investigation. So
the reliability of them is not like, okay, they're following this protocol. I mean, it's very broad, basically, right?
Yeah. And then the second, I think, even more interesting aspect is not just the case of I've got lived experience and that gives me a better knowledge from the diagnostician. It's a case of I've got lived experience, whereas the authors of the DSM did not have lived experience. Therefore, I know more about autism than the authors of the DSM. So somebody can legitimately self-diagnose as autistic or whatever diagnosis, even though they recognize they do not meet the DSM criteria, because they're in a better epistemic situation to know autism than the authors of the DSM. That's the other argument, and as far as I can tell, quite a lot of advocates of self-diagnosis support that. Now, that I think is even more epistemologically interesting, but also more epistemologically challenging. So I've got a recent paper out that basically says, well, to get that argument to work, that depends upon what we take psychiatric diagnoses to be. So if we take them, for example, as these things out there in the world waiting to be found, then the way in which you may have better knowledge or not have better knowledge than the authors of the DSM works in one way. Whereas if we take these as, say, for example, psychiatric diagnoses as, say, the product of theoretical virtues, then the way in which you do or do not have better knowledge than the authors of the DSM works differently. And thirdly, if we take them as, say, the application of our ethical values, there's a huge practical ethical element to saying what psychiatric diagnoses there are, then again, it works very differently to say you have better or worse knowledge from the DSM, authors of the DSM. So in a sense, that argument, how it works, partly depends on what we take psychiatric diagnoses to be. And then given an account of what we take psychiatric diagnoses to be, well, I mean, it's complicated. I fully understand the basic principle, but I would like to see it worked out in more detail. And when I've tried to work it out in more detail, I can certainly see ways in which it could work, but also ways in which it could go wrong.
Yeah.
I suppose my biggest concern is that if ultimately we just end up massively expanding autism, then under the account of epistemology I gave earlier of what constitutes a good psychiatric diagnosis, it's meant to be cohesive. Cohesiveness is a good thing. Whereas if we just radically expand autism through self-diagnosis, it loses the cohesiveness. I'm not against people who could benefit from diagnoses getting a new diagnosis. I just think potentially a better approach would be creating new diagnoses. If rather than just saying you can self-diagnose with autism even if you don't meet the DSM criteria, perhaps a better approach would be the neurodiversity movement to start saying, well, let's make new diagnoses. They might not be recognized by psychiatry, but we think they're right, and people can benefit from them. Meanwhile, by having new diagnoses, we're not just going to keep massively expanding the current ones. I suppose that's what I think would be a safer approach than just simply, I'm going to self-diagnose, even though I recognize I'm not that close to the diagnostic criteria.
Right. Well, and especially if I can imagine the neurodiversity movement puts forward sort of its own criteria for something, and then provides a sufficient source for, I guess, I don't want to say treatment per se, because especially if that's not the goal of creating sort of like of speaking against deficits or, and they're wanting to frame things in more differences in abilities and things like that. But at least it provides a framework for people to feel comfortable such that the value of having some sort of a DSM diagnosis is sort of doesn't matter. And I'll give you an example, and I'm kind of curious of your thoughts on this in terms of where another kind of disorder where self-diagnosis is advocated for, yet it differs from the DSM. So I've done a lot of studies related to addiction. Mainly substance addictions, particularly. Now, with substance addiction in the DSM, the standard, I believe they got rid of dependence and use disorder. But anyway, I think the primary disorder is substance use disorder, which you can receive if you've developed or meet certain criteria for essentially like addiction. Addiction will be like a general term. Now, those who receive a lot of treatment for addiction are often associated with sort of like self-help programs like Alcoholics Anonymous. And within sort of a treatment that's not tied to any sort of formal medical treatment, they are encouraged to self-diagnose based on a minimalist set of criteria. And almost they're not encouraged to not receive diagnoses by the medical community. But the thought is like part of the treatment or part of the sort of it's like acceptance of your disorder and acceptance of the condition to move forward. And self-diagnosis is seen as a virtue in terms of starting on the path to recovery or something like that. And I think what's interesting about that, and from what I've studied, is the particular criteria are different from the DSM, but no one really cares. No one is like up in arms. No one is advocating, oh my gosh, we have to change the DSM. They're getting it wrong. It's almost a non-issue because there's not anything to lose necessarily or gain. They're just kind of, now I could see it in terms of maybe getting access to treatment, but it's like the identification as a quote addict or an alcoholic is tied to another kind of outlet, not a medical outlet. So I'm curious of like in this response, how you see this instance that I've just described as somewhat different, or I guess there's just more social things going on, but it's very much from what I've studied, like self-diagnosis is advocated for, it's encouraged, not in a medical setting, but in this sort of, and I don't even want to say alternative just because it's so representative, but in a large scale way, a movement of sorts, yet there isn't much of a contention or a debate because I guess for all intents and purposes, there's not a lack of coverage or a lack of misrepresentation, despite there being there is like, let's say, stigma still associated, but yeah, maybe your thoughts on this sort of alternative case.
Yeah. I guess again, it comes down to the question of what the point of psychiatric diagnoses are. And in the case of substance abuse disorder, it looks like there's very much a definite end goal, that being ending the substance abuse, or at least coping with it or managing it in whatever way. Whereas, and so in that regard, I can see potential definite advantages I don't know much about this, but if it helped someone on the process of treatment to identify as having a diagnosis, even if it doesn't fit the DSM, then I suppose I can't see any particular problem with that. That seems perfectly fine to me. I suppose in relation to sort of your stereotypical diagnoses, or indeed autism again, what's the point and purpose of an autism diagnosis? I guess, given that there's no treatments and very little, and obviously most people don't want treatments and there's very few services, I suppose the main obvious one would be self-understanding, an ability to find other people who are similar to yourself. Now, the question is, are we just watering down autism by self-diagnosis? Admittedly, to say yes or no depends upon what's going on with self-diagnosis, something we have very little empirical data on. The existing empirical data largely suggests most people who self-diagnose are not doing it accurately, but then you've got the question of, is the DSM wrong? I suppose this is what I'm thinking. I don't have a problem with challenging the DSM at all. indeed, under my sort of pluralist modeling position, I think we should use the DSM and use alternatives to the DSM, whether it's RDoC, research domain criteria, HiTOP, hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology, or whether it's just alternative categorical systems. So take the DSM and throw in subtypes, or take the DSM, merge diagnoses, or just mix it up. I like the DSM as a general principle, but we could do DSM-style diagnoses of different things, as long as you're clear about what you're doing.
Yeah.
In the case of alcohol, substance abuse disorder, it sounds like they're clear. It sounds like there was a set criteria that's different to the DSM, and it's there for a particular purpose. Whereas if one person modifies autism when they self-diagnose and does it in one direction, and someone else does it in a completely different direction, that's probably not going to be too helpful. Well, obviously it depends. Okay, if we're talking lots and lots of different directions, that's going to be quite a different case. It sounds like the discussion the thing you mentioned there is an alternative way of diagnosing, but it's still fairly clear of what the criteria is, and it's clear why it's being done.
Right.
Whereas it's not clear people who modify the diagnostic criteria. I've not seen a single account from the top of my head in any of the papers I've read that's actually outlined what these alternatives are.
Right. Well, and I should say it's perhaps more, well, in terms of maybe the end goal for what is the purpose of the diagnosis for, I mean, some of it is understanding, but also it's, access to treatment. But you're right. It's different with autism in other disorders, in other ways. Like, what exactly are you up to or trying to do by providing the context for receiving a diagnosis? I just found it sociologically interesting that there isn't as much of a clamoring. And if anything, the debate is perhaps more on, it's more on the alternative sides of harm reduction, which is essentially individuals who advocate for sort of individuals who can readily sort of like, even if they're sort of diagnosed or self-identify with addiction in some kind of way, continue to use, but in a way that reduces harm, so to speak. And those advocates are sort of against this sort of like, abstinence must be the abstinence only kind of approach. So in some ways there is, there's definitely heterogeneity within that community from what I've researched and studied. I just found it interesting though that there isn't quite the same level of like frustration with the DSM. Like really, there just is, in terms of, but perhaps again, that's historically relevant in terms of being what are individuals and groups wanting out of something. And if anything, the debate with substance use has been between the experts themselves or the committee itself, because there did used to be a difference between substance dependence and substance use, and dependence was seen as like more like physiological dependence, as almost like a different category, kind of like a lesser category of sorts. And now they've they've essentially subsumed it into one, and some people aren't happy about it. Some people still think it doesn't represent, but they feel like they've lost some sort of category of people but that's what happens as we know, in terms of creating the criteria. Not everyone's happy, but they're doing the best they can in terms of making these decisions.
There's just one other thing I just occurred to me, which I worry about self-diagnosis. It might not be applicable to a substance abuse one, insofar as if you self-diagnose with substance abuse not based upon the DSM, my guess would be you're still pretty much constrained insofar as what you're going to be fitting. It's not the case of, oh, well, you should, according to the DSM, you're actually schizophrenic, but you've diagnosed with substance abuse, because it's radically different. Whereas in the case of autism, you've got multiple diagnoses that have lots of stuff in common. And it's quite possible someone could say, well, I don't fit the DSM diagnosis of autism, but that's because the DSM is wrong. I'm going to self-diagnose with autism, without realizing they do fit the DSM diagnosis of, say, schizoid personality disorder or schizotypal personality disorder. Now, I think that is potentially problematic, because what it means is you've got another person who's now considering themselves to be autistic, which you've already got loads of autistic people out there doing advocacy. Well, someone there would have been, if we followed the DSM, another person with, say, schizoid personality disorder, and now there's not. And there's only so many people out there with schizoid personality disorder, and there's only so much activism going on. So you've now got another person to do activism for autism, and one less person to do activism for schizoid personality disorder. And guess which diagnosis already has so much activism going on for it already?
Yeah.
So it might be beneficial for the person, or it might make no difference to the person if they get diagnosed with one or the other. But when it comes to communities, we're getting more autistic people and not the other thing that they would have been diagnosed with if they've actually gone to a psychiatrist and the psychiatrist had followed the DSM. And that's potentially unfair for people with other diagnoses. Yeah. I appreciate it's very easy for me to say all this because I've got an official autism diagnosis and had them for a while.
Right.
And I just want to say that, what one argument is that ethnic minorities don't get autism diagnoses, and it's underrepresented in women, things like that, and potentially other issues like transgender, underrepresented there. So, yeah, don't get me wrong, there's potentially very good reasons why some might self-diagnose. It's just we also need to look at the more broader phenomena, places where it's not so clear what's going on. There's not a clear case of, yeah, you're definitely autistic, except you've not got it because you're an ethnic minority. There's lots of much more complicated cases.
Right. Well, thank you for the rich discussion, Sam. This is excellent so far. I could definitely ask you more questions about self-diagnosis because I perhaps myself am very interested, obviously, but we're running a little bit short on time. So I want to just jump to my last question in terms of what do you take to be the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today?
I suppose one thing I just want to say is that I'm being an autistic person, I'm very, very focused upon what I'm interested in and don't really look at the wider picture. So I've got my interest in philosophy of science and might not have as much awareness as your average philosopher of science about the wider movement. And also, as a philosopher of psychiatry, I focus upon that. What I can say is in relation to my field, it's the whole I aim to diversify the way in which we go about doing philosophy of psychiatry and by extension philosophy of science. So things like epistemic injustice, trying to get people who've not had a privileged voice getting more access to say what they want to say. And that's great. That I fundamentally think has lots of positives. The question that I always wonder about is, how do we then assess what we have to say, given that we know that producing scientific knowledge is so hard, and also relatedly, that we know that most people actually have bad self-understanding and a bad introspection. So, on one hand, we've sort of got this political motive, which I think is a good one, of let's get more people involved in the process of producing knowledge, including the process of doing philosophy. And obviously that comes into something like, let's get autistic people involved in philosophy when it comes to talking about psychiatric diagnoses. Undeniably, I've massively benefited from that myself. At the same time, you then got to say, well, I have an ability to critique this and say, well, by the way, I'm listening to your views, but it also could be completely mistaken. A big name in philosophy of medicine is all I'm going to say. Once said to me something at a conference. I'm not going to say who this was. This person works in philosophy of medicine. They don't have a diagnosis themselves, as far as I'm aware. They said it's, quote, very difficult to criticize people with psychiatric diagnoses when they get involved in this sort of research. So on one hand, we want to encourage them to be involved. On the other hand, given that I think science in general is already so difficult, and science improves by this process of trying to study a phenomena, and eventually after loads of studies we get a rough idea of what's going on, we need to be critical of these new voices, just as critical as the old voices. And so that's a potential tension of how to resolve that. I suppose I can only say in the preface to my book, I say, well, yeah, I'm autistic. I may have come to insights about this topic, which I otherwise wouldn't have got through being autistic. But at the same time, I have not shown any of my views which have come from being autistic are actually any good. They could be
Yeah, why not just test them?
Potentially might not help, or we may even make things worse.
Yeah, and especially...
Yeah.
Well, yeah, especially when you speak from experience, like you can get some wonderful ideas, but especially as you come up to realize the heterogeneity of perhaps the condition, like your experience may not represent every, it might be it's tough. It's a fine line. And I totally get what the person you're sharing's, what the point there, because there is a level where, sharing one's experience can be seen as sort of denying, like criticizing one's position on a disorder from someone who has lived experience can come across as like denying their experience when that's not what they're trying to do. I mean, it could be, but generally the thought is maybe just critiquing the ideas, but it can be challenging because that's what it comes across as. And we got to find a way to have some, helpful criticism that is not meant to be offensive or something like that.
I suppose just a quick follow-up on that, I do have a paper which I critique some, shall we say, experts by experience. They've made various philosophical claims in a few articles, and I've got a paper that responds to it. It's been rejected, I believe, double the amount of times as any other paper I've ever written.
Interesting.
And all I can say is that when I've shared some of the views these people have said in this paper, these people who aren't philosophers, but they've got expert by experience, so they're writing about philosophy, when I've shared it with other philosophers, they've said, yeah, that is not working. That's just not a credible philosophy of science. Maybe we're all wrong. Maybe the philosophers are wrong. Maybe they're right. I won't deny it, but I'm having a lot of difficulty, is all I can say.
I could see it being, I mean, it's broaching on a sensitive topic, and I think it's good of you to do it. And I think you're coming with the right intentions and the right mind and the right heart, from everything I've spoken with. But I could understand it being perhaps a challenge, and for an editor, maybe a bit cautious in terms of publishing a work that's going to be challenging in this regard. I don't know. I'd be curious maybe off air to hear about some of the feedback that you've gotten, or maybe ways they've suggested, making it better. But it sounds to me, I mean, from what you're saying, you're sympathetic, and I'm sympathetic to what you're describing. So I hope you can get it published. I hope you can get it out there, even if you have to post it on your website or something. Oh, the last thing I wanted to share with other listeners, for more about Sam, who's obviously has a lot of wonderful ideas and insights, and you should continue to listen to him more, is that you have a YouTube and potentially a future autism podcast coming out. Could you share a little bit about those, or just if you want to? About
3-4 months ago, I started a YouTube channel, Philosophy of Psychiatric Diagnoses. It's currently got 6 videos on it. I've got 3 I'm going to record hopefully fairly soon. And admittedly, once I've done those 3, I'm then going to try and review every single paper published on self-diagnosis. So that could be fun. If you want to learn about self-diagnosis, I'm going to hopefully cover all 30 ones which I've read so far, and I've got another 30 or so which, well, a lot of them are masters and dissertations and stuff. But anyway, so that's one thing. I do have plans to do a History of Autism podcast, but those plans have been going on for 5-6 years, and I've just never got round to it. Now I've got the book out of the way. That could be, that may or may not happen. The trouble is, if I'm going to do it, it's going to be probably like 30 hours long or something. So it's going to be basically a book in itself, a History of Autism podcast. So I don't want to start it, get 3 episodes in and think, no, this was foolish of me. So we'll see.
I think there's something that like 80 or some 95% of podcasts don't make it past episode 20 or something. So even if you do, it's okay. I think it's worth giving it a shot. But you're right. I get that. You want to, if you start it, you want to give yourself and the listeners a good run for
Well, put it this way: the one plan I had was it would only be episode 4 when I actually started talking about autism, but that plan has been shelved.
Oh wow! Yeah, that might be a little challenge. People who come in for the history of autism podcast be like, "What are you getting on? What is happening?" It was.
Yeah. So it's going to be a grand introduction, and then there was going to be pre-autism episode 1, pre-autism episode 2, and I was like, no, just don't do that. Don't do that.
Okay. Well, I mean, if anything, and has there been like a self-diagnosis special volume in somewhere, or I might just have been misremembering. Like, did that ever exist, or
self-diagnosis special volume?
Well, anyway, I think you should consider pitching it, because I think that, or at least should be a conference theme at the next AAPP or something, because I think it would be very interesting to see.
Yeah.
I forget what's next year.
Yeah,
I think the next year is something else. 2025. I haven't checked it out, but
it's certainly an area of interest. So it's good for I've got my foot in early.
Yes,
and I have another paper that's basically just needs referencing and editing, and that can go off. So there's a third one will be
fantastic,
going off soon, hopefully.
All right. Well, Sam, thank you so much for sticking around. It was great to chat. I look forward to chatting again sometime and meeting you in person. But anyways, thank you for staying with us this Thursday evening. I hope you have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Bye-bye.